So, without further delay, Dr. Richard Johnson is a professor of medicine at the University of Colorado. Dr. Johnson is a clinician and a medical scientist who has been internationally recognized for his work on sugar and especially fructose and its product, uric acid.
It's really a great pleasure to come back and to talk to my friends. So the cardiometabolic epidemic, I mean, it's so apparent to all of us that there's an increase in obesity and diabetes, as well as in high blood pressure and heart disease. And although heart disease has been decreasing in recent years, a lot of that is because we're just getting more efficient at treating heart disease. Not just an increase in metabolic diseases like the classic ones we've talked about, but there's also an increase frequency in diseases that we don't naturally just attribute to a metabolic disorder, but diseases like Alzheimer's disease and certain cancers that are associated with obesity, like breast cancer, colon cancer, liver cancer, and pancreatic cancer, are also increasing. And in fact, we now recognize that metabolic syndrome has the classic association shown on the left. There are these other associations with metabolic syndrome on the right that include neurologic diseases, behavioral diseases, cancer, preeclampsia, sarcopenia, and even aging has been linked with metabolic syndrome. So today we're going to talk about our insights into what might be driving these conditions. And although I've historically focused on the classic associations, in this talk we're going to talk about some of the newer associations and how they might be related. So the big question is what are causing these epidemics? And of course, everyone has learned and has heard that it's from bad habits. That the problem is that the food is very delicious and hard to resist, and we are eating more, and we definitely are eating more, and we're being more inactive because of TV and all the stuff, the internet, REs, etc. And so it's really thought to be a disease, a tragedy, of our own success, where we are eating too much because the food's too palatable and easy to access, and we're exercising too little. And the consequence is that the extra energy is stored as fat. But we know that altering behavior by eating less and exercising more doesn't always work. It often works for a little while, but there's a big relapse rate. And so this raises the question that it may not just be a behavioral issue, but may in fact involve biologic mechanisms. And in fact, what we've learned is that, in the wild, animals regulate their weight very well. And during the summer, animals generally will not increase their weight. If they eat more one day, they'll eat less the next. They know how to regulate their weight. They know what percent body fat they want, and it's usually like 10, 15%. But for some animals, they will purposely become fat, like before hibernation or long distance migration or nesting. And these animals will suddenly, like several months before the event, before the winter comes or before they migrate, they'll start to change their behavior where they're eating more, they appear to be hungry more, and you can show that they're developing leptin resistance, where they don't respond well to leptin. And so leptin is a hormone that stimulates satiety. And so these animals seem to be continually hungry and eating. They actually become insulin resistant, which may help maintain glucose levels in their blood for the brain when there's no food around, because the brain can use some glucose independent of insulin. And these animals will also store fat in their livers and in their, not just their adipose tissues, but in their blood. And really, when you look at it, you say, my gosh, these guys are developing metabolic syndrome, but it's not pathophysiologic. This is what they need. It's like a type of fat storage syndrome that they need to survive, because when they hibernate, they will burn that energy, and that energy or burn that fat, and that fat will produce the energy they need. So in this scenario, it's the same equation. They're eating too much because they're hungry and leptin resistant, and they're burning too little. They're burning less fat, but in this case, their fat oxidation process has been blocked. And the result is that they do increase their fat stores, but it's in this situation, they are eating more because they remain hungry, and they sit more because they have less energy. So what's the trigger that triggers this? And could that be related to what happens to humans? Well, it's been known that some of these animals will eat large amounts of fruit in the fall that seems to coincide with the triggering of this biologic switch where they suddenly become hungry, leptin resistant. And when I talk about eating fruit, I don't mean like eating 1 or 2 fruit a day. I mean like eating 10,000 grapes in a 24-hour period. And that's what the bear does. And it's sort of amazing how much fruit they will eat. Well, fruit contains a sugar called fructose, and that's the main nutrient in fruit. And fructose turns out to be very, very, it's a sugar that really can switch animals into kind of being hungry and eating more and becoming and developing the metabolic syndrome. And if these were our brothers from the same litter, and one was offered fructose in the drinking water, the other one not. And in the first week or two, when they're drinking the fructose, they'll eat less chow. They actually try to regulate their weight. But after about 2 or 3 weeks, that regulation of weight goes to haste, and the animals just start eating more and more and become fat. And in fact, our group has identified that this biologic switch isn't just metabolic syndrome. It stimulates hunger, it stimulates thirst, it stimulates foraging, all to help find food. It increases food intake through causing leptin resistance. It drops resting energy metabolism, so it doesn't affect the foraging. But when they're not foraging, they actually kind of become like couch potatoes. They become insulin resistant, which reduces glucose uptake in the muscle, which also reduces energy metabolism, stimulates inflammation, kind of systemic inflammation, and it maintains blood pressure, raises blood pressure, increases glomerular pressure, and causes a shift to glycolysis because mitochondria are inhibited, and this helps to reduce oxygen needs. So the question is, how does fructose activate this switch? This is kind of the key figure. Normally, when we think about food, we think of it as providing energy. And energy, we usually think of as active energy, or ATP. This is what the mitochondria make and which we use to do things. So the classic thinking is that when you eat food, you're replacing the needed energy in the body. So you bring up the ATP, and when the ATP levels become high, the excess energy goes to fat. And this is what everyone was taught. But actually, that is not how it happens. When you eat fructose, and this seems to be a specific nutrient that does this, it lowers the ATP in a cell. And it does that by suppressing the mitochondria. Now, when you have a low ATP, that is sort of an alarm signal. It only reduces it like 25%. It doesn't reduce it to a life-threatening thing that leads to fight and flight responses and starvation responses. This drops the ATP 30%. And it's like the light goes up on the dashboard that the fuel is low. And at the same time, it blocks the regeneration of the metabolism of fat to release ATP. So it creates a low energy state, a low active energy state. And then the calories, when they come in, because ATP is suppressed, they preferentially go to storing fat. It's a brilliant system. It's like an alarm system that makes you think you're low in energy, even though you have fat. And for example, this was a paper that it's not our group, but it was another group, Lane's group. They gave glucose, they injected it into the brain, and immediately ATP levels go up. The animals become develop satiety. They actually show decreased food intake. But if you inject fructose, it's the exact opposite. ATP levels fall and you become hungry. And this really is a great graphic example of how these two sugars that look almost identical, they same molecular weight, but look, they have a very different effect on energy. Just going to point out that there's a caloric pathway where fructose is converted to energy and fat, like all calories. So all foods have this caloric pathway. But there's also a non-caloric pathway activated by fructose. And that non-caloric pathway involves the rapid consumption of ATP driven by this enzyme called KHK, or fructokinase. Then there's this removal of AMP through a specific enzyme called AMP deaminase. It generates uric acid in the process. Uric acid activates NADPH oxidase that translocates to the mitochondria, inducing an oxidative stress that blocks ATP production. And it also inhibits an enzyme called AMP activated protein kinase. The result is you get a low ATP. This just kind of shows a little bit an example of it. If you take liver cells, you put fructose on them, you get this oxidative stress. You can block it with allopurinol, which is a drug that lowers uric acid. Some people think that xanthine oxidase produces it. Well, it does produce some oxidants on its own, but you can prove that it's the uric acid by adding back the uric acid, and you get that oxidative stress. Uric acid is a kind of a key player in how fructose works. And what's interesting, and I think many of you know this, is that humans have high uric acid levels compared to most mammals, and it's due to a mutation that occurred in an enzyme called uricase, millions of years ago. And in fact, it's using molecular evolution, you can actually identify what the mutations were and when they occurred. And they occurred around 12 to 15 million years ago. And they involved not just the great apes, which involved, orangutans, chimps, gorillas, and eventually also humans fall in this group, but also lesser apes. And there were parallel mutations suggesting that there was some survival advantage to having a higher uric acid. But why would that be? I mean, uric acid causes gout, forms crystals. I mean, that's not a survival advantage. You'd have trouble escaping a predator if you had gout. In 1920, in the United States, the mean uric acid level was 3.5. 5 was considered markedly elevated back then. Then by 1960, 5.5 was the mean, and 6.5 was viewed as really high. And today, it's not uncommon to have uric acids of 6. And so now it's 7, or some places say 8 is high. So we keep changing our, what's high, because every decade it's going up. And it's going up because of the sugar and the alcohol and all the foods we're eating that are driving the uric acid up. So now, maybe 20% of the population have hyperuricemia, especially in men. And when you look at the relationship of uric acid to obesity, it is pretty dramatic. I never thought it was this dramatic, but look at this. This is from the N. Haynes. There's a stepwise increase in uric acid with obesity. There's a stepwise increase with diabetes. There's a stepwise increase with hypertension. And there's even more of an asymptotic rise with kidney disease. It is there. There is a relationship that cannot be denied, but that doesn't mean causality. But our work suggested that it could. And when we lowered uric acid, we could block some of these effects. So we've gone on to try to understand how it cause weight gain. And we found that fructose does it through leptin resistance. And the way you prove leptin resistance is you have to inject the animal with leptin. And normally when you inject an animal with leptin, they will reduce their food intake for about 12 hours. And you can measure that over, like a 24-hour. And when you give them fructose, they become completely resistant to leptin. Leptin doesn't work at all. And as you probably know, most people with obesity have been found to have leptin resistance. And we found that was what was responsible for weight gain. And because they eat more and that does it. And if you block the ability for them to eat more, they won't gain weight. So weight gain is really a calorie-based problem. And fat intake, when you become leptin resistant, you also start liking fat more, as you probably are aware. And when you eat more fat, that really accelerates weight gain because you're leptin resistant. On the other hand, we found that the mitochondrial effects of fructose was what drove all these metabolic diseases. In fact, we could put animals on caloric restriction and reduce their calories a lot, but if they ate sugar, they would become diabetic, hypertensive, fatty liver, etc. Okay, well, it's great to say fructose is important, probably is, but what about cultures that don't eat a lot of sugar? I mean, it's not that they don't get obesity. What about the emperor penguin who gets fat and there's no fruit down in Antarctica? So there's got to be other mechanisms. Well, the big surprise was that fructose can be made from glucose. And we've known this, but we never knew how important it was. But there's this pathway called the polyol pathway where glucose is converted to fructose. And this is the only way fructose is made in the body. And what drives it? Guess what drives it? High carb diet, high glycemic carbs, diabetes. You can take a diabetic person who has bad glucose control. You don't have to feed them any fructose. They all have high fructose levels, blood levels, and urine levels of fructose. It's well published. And likewise, if you give animals carbs or even humans carbs, you can measure a rise in fructose production, both production and levels with that. So it turns out that you can make fructose from carbs. And that's really important because there's a lot of these carbs called high glycemic carbs, starchy foods like rice, potatoes, cereal, bread. And if you eat those, your glucose levels go up. And as your glucose levels go up, you can convert as much as 30% of that glucose to fructose. So it's not the 3% in a normal, under normal glycemic conditions. When it goes up, the amount of fructose produced goes way up. And we could show that in animals by giving them glucose, showing that their fructose levels go up, they become fat, they become insulin resistant. And if we block that fructokinase enzyme, that KHK enzyme, we could block obesity. Now, there was some obesity that was being driven by the insulin. And we were able to show that there's really two mechanisms. There's an insulin-dependent mechanism, and there's a fructose-dependent mechanism. And fructose makes up about half of the effects, and glucose insulin makes up about half the effects. Well, once we realized that carbs could cause obesity through this explained why a low-carb diet was so effective. And if you go on a low-carb diet or a keto diet, you're going to block both the fructose you eat and the fructose you make. And that's why you can go on a high-fat diet and you won't get fat. So a high-fat, high-protein diet. But we also realized that salt and low oxygen, there are these different things that can activate this enzyme that could convert glucose to sorbitol. And we know that animals like salt, and it's been associated, salt licks it's sodium chloride salt licks that count, and animals will eat it before winter, and it helps them gain weight. And in fact, some groups give salt to try to stimulate weight gain in domesticated animals. When we put animals on salt, and we were able to put salt in the drinking water, we had to add a little sucralose, but we had sucralose in the controls, and sucralose does not cause weight gain or obesity or metabolic syndrome. But anyway, we found that when we gave salt, that it took a longer time. It's like instead of 3 weeks to become leptin resistant, really it was like 3 months. But eventually the animals really became fat. I mean, like really fat. They became diabetic. They became hypertensive. They developed a lot of these findings. And if we blocked fructokinase, even if they ate all the same amount of salt, they did not develop metabolic syndrome, and they didn't develop high blood pressure, and they were protected from cardiac hypertrophy. In fact, what we learned was that the way salt works is through this pathway. That it's not about the amount of salt; it's about the bringing the salt concentration up in the blood, and then that activating this pathway. And in fact, we did studies, I won't show them, but you can give salt to people. And if you give salt, blood pressure goes up. If you give salt with water so that osmolality doesn't change, they don't get high blood pressure. And we did this too. We also found that fructose also increases serum osmolality. It's dehydrating. It actually shifts water into the cells with glycogen formation. And if we gave water, we could actually suppress some of this weight gain. And we could suppress this pathway. So then we also started thinking about umami foods. And if you look on the far left here, you'll see that when ATP is degraded to make uric acid, it makes AMP and IMP. And so this is part of the pathway that we've identified that drives obesity. But when you eat monosodium glutamate, which is this flavor that causes the savory flavor of umami, it gets converted into AMP and to uric acid. And in fact, if you put MSG, which is, this added to make food taste better, it's like commonly used in Chinese restaurants. When it's added, animals will start drinking more and more of it. They like it, and they suddenly become leptin resistant, and they start eating more. Their uric acid goes up, their ATP levels fall. What we now know is that it's a complicated pathway where sugar can provide fructose or glucose that can be converted to fructose. Salt can accelerate this. Low water intake can accelerate this. That umami can come in and join in this pathway here.